Paris, 1943. Outside, the city groaned under occupation. Boots echoed on the cobblestone streets. Curfews ruled the night, and the scent of rationed coffee drifted through the smoke of war. Inside Café de Flore, a man sat by the fogged window, his round glasses catching the dim light of a dying afternoon. Jean-Paul Sartre, writer, soldier, prisoner, teacher, and now, the reluctant prophet of a generation that no longer believed in God. He stirred his coffee slowly, watching the raindrops race down the glass. People hurried by, coats wrapped tight, heads bowed. They looked small, mechanical, obedient, as if the world had stolen from them the very idea of choice. Sartre felt something shift inside him. The war had stripped away illusions. What remained was the bare, unbearable fact of existence. He once wrote that man is a useless passion. It was not despair he spoke of, but a realization that life has no script, no divine author, no blueprint to follow. The universe, indifferent and silent, offers nothing. And yet, here we are, alive, aware, condemned to decide what our lives will mean. That, for Sartre, was both miracle and curse. He did not come to this idea in peace or comfort. A few years earlier, he had been captured by the Germans and sent to a prison camp. There, stripped of books and classrooms, he watched men crumble under boredom and fear. What haunted him most was not the brutality of guards or the hunger of days, but the strange freedom that persisted even in captivity. Even there, behind wire fences under constant surveillance, a man could choose how to act, what to believe, whether to help or betray another. Freedom, Sartre realized, was inescapable. No wall could contain it. No authority could erase it, and that made it terrifying. When he returned to Paris, he carried that realization like a wound. The world expected him to return to teaching, to literature. But Sartre began writing as though every page were an emergency, a way to make sense of the unbearable clarity that had struck him. The book he would finish in the coming year, Being and Nothingness, was his attempt to understand what it means to exist without excuses. For him, existence came first, before essence, before purpose, indeed before reason. We are born not as what we are, but as what we will choose to become. This inversion shattered centuries of philosophy. In a single sentence, he overturned the comfortable order of the Western mind. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. It sounds liberating, and it is. But in the silence after those words, something darker lurks. If no God defines us, if no nature assigns us a purpose, then we alone bear the full weight of our choices. Every decision, every gesture becomes an act of self-creation, and if we fail, there is no one left to blame. Freedom, in Sartre's world, is not a gift. It is a sentence. He looked around the cafe at the chatter of students and lovers. They spoke of the future as though it were waiting for them somewhere beyond the war. Sartre envied their simplicity. He envied their belief that life could return to normal, that there was still such a thing as normal. For him, the war had exposed a truth that could never be unseen. Human beings are absurdly free. We invent meaning in a universe that offers none. And yet, that is precisely what gives life its strange dignity. To exist is to choose. To choose is to define oneself. And to define oneself is to carry, in every instant, the entire responsibility of humanity. He often thought of freedom not as a light, but as a fire. It warms, but it burns. It can lead to greatness or to horror. In the name of freedom, people resist tyranny, create art, fall in love. But in the same name, they lie, betray, destroy. Sartre saw both sides. He saw how the idea of freedom, when misunderstood, could excuse cruelty. The man who says, "I am free," might mean I owe nothing to anyone. Sartre rejected that. True freedom, he argued, demands authenticity, a recognition that in choosing for oneself, one also chooses for all mankind. But even authenticity offered no peace. It demanded constant vigilance, constant awareness of the nothingness beneath our illusions. To be authentic is to live without masks, without excuses, without pretending that fate or God or biology made us what we are. And who, really, could bear that every hour of the day? He smiled bitterly. Outside, the Gestapo trucks rolled past. Inside, the warmth of conversation returned to the room. The world was pretending again, pretending that freedom was suspended, that orders came from elsewhere, that responsibility belonged to others. Sartre understood that temptation. It is easier to believe that someone else decides, that we are victims of circumstance. But deep down, he knew, even choosing to obey is still a choice. That thought haunted him. It was the reason he would later say, "Man is condemned to be free." Condemned because he did not create himself. And yet free, because once thrown into existence, he must choose every moment of his being. No God, no moral law, no social structure can relieve him of that burden. Freedom is not what we gain when the world grants permission. It is what we cannot escape, even in chains. The paradox tormented him. How could freedom feel like imprisonment? Why did this absolute power, to define, to create, to choose, feel so heavy, so suffocating? The answer, he thought, lay in consciousness itself. To be conscious is to stand apart from oneself, to see one's actions, to judge them, to know that they could have been otherwise. Every "I am" carries the silent echo of "I could have been different." And in that echo lives both anguish and possibility. Sometimes, in the quiet of the café, Sartre imagined an easier philosophy. A belief in destiny, perhaps. A faith in divine will. Something to silence the chaos of the mind. But he could not lie to himself. He had seen too much of human history, too much of human cruelty, to accept that anyone else was steering the wheel. No, the universe was indifferent. But that indifference did not excuse us. It demanded that we invent meaning where none existed. He took another sip of coffee, bitter and thin. Across the room, Simone de Beauvoir was reading a manuscript. They had made a pact years before, to live freely, without marriage, without lies. It was a bold experiment, and a painful one. Their relationship would become a living example of Sartre's philosophy. Freedom tested against love, authenticity tested against desire. Even love, he thought, could become a form of bad faith, a way to escape oneself by dissolving into another. But to love authentically was to face the other as another free being, to will their freedom as one's own. The rain had stopped. Evening fell on the city, the lights of the Seine trembling in the dark. Sartre lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl upward, disappearing into the ceiling. He wondered if humanity would ever be ready for the kind of freedom he spoke of. A freedom with no instructions. A freedom that demands we invent ourselves, every day from nothing. Most people, he thought, do not want that kind of freedom. They want safety, structure, meaning already given. They want to be told who they are. They want to live as waiters, soldiers, citizens, defined by roles, rules, uniforms. But beneath all that, the truth remains. Every role is a performance, and every performance hides the terrifying stage of choice. He knew that most would call his ideas dark, even nihilistic. But Sartre saw something else within that darkness, a spark of defiance. To say that life has no meaning is not to surrender, but to recognize that we are the ones who give it meaning. And that act, as fragile and fleeting as it may be, is what makes us human. As he left the café that night, The cold wind caught his coat and carried the smell of rain and smoke. The streets were nearly empty. Somewhere, a soldier's footsteps echoed. For a moment, Sartre felt both completely alone and completely responsible for everything around him. The city, the war, the silence. Freedom, he thought, was not a blessing to be grateful for. It was the weight of existence itself. And yet, as he turned the corner toward his apartment, he felt a strange calm. To live without excuses was painful, yes, but it was real. In a world of illusions, that reality was a kind of grace. The philosopher walked on, into the dark Paris night, carrying with him the unbearable gift that no one had asked for, and no one could refuse. Morning again in Paris, the rain has stopped, but the sky remains the color of tin. Sartre sits at his desk, a cigarette burning slowly beside a pile of papers. The window rattles with the hum of the city below, trams clattering, voices arguing, life resuming its mechanical rhythm after another night of blackout sirens. The war still breathes outside, but here, inside this small room on the Rue Bonaparte, a different kind of battle unfolds. The battle to understand what it means to exist. Existence. Such a small word, yet heavy as stone. Philosophers before him had spoken of essence, of fixed natures, eternal forms, divine blueprints that explain what things are. But Sartre had turned the order upside down. Existence precedes essence. Man appears first, naked and unformed, and only later defines what he will be. He writes slowly, almost whispering the words to himself as if afraid they might disappear. There is no human nature, he notes, because there is no God to have a conception of it. The sentence feels dangerous, not merely to theology, but to comfort itself. For if no divine craftsman designed us, then the task of definition belongs entirely to us. At first, it sounds empowering. Freedom blooms in the void like a sudden light. But, as he sits there, he senses the weight of that light pressing down. Because once you realize there is no script, no predestined role, you also realize there is no refuge. Every action, every silence, every breath becomes a statement of who you are. And in that realization, a kind of vertigo begins. He thinks of the word anguish, not simple fear or sadness, but the dizzying feeling that strikes when you stand on the edge of infinite choice. The soldier who must decide whether to join the resistance or stay safe at home. The lover who must choose truth over comfort. The teacher who must decide what kind of world his lessons will build. There is no one to consult, no rule book to lean on. In every instant, you invent your morality anew. That is the weight of existence. Not merely to live, but to justify living. Sartre looks back on his years as a teacher at the Lycée Condorcet before the war tore through Europe. He remembers his students, young, ambitious, certain of the future. They asked him what philosophy was for. He told them it was the act of learning to live without excuses. They laughed then, not understanding. Now, with half of them scattered or dead, the lesson seems cruelly clear. The modern world, Sartre believed, had been living on borrowed meaning. Religion, nationalism, ideology, all had offered ready-made answers. But the war revealed how easily those answers collapse. Beneath the uniforms and the flags, human beings remain what they always were, creatures of decision, trembling before their own freedom. He stands and walks to the mirror. His reflection stares back, ordinary, almost anonymous. There is nothing divine in it, no glow of destiny. Just a man, aging, uncertain, yet responsible for everything he will do. It is a strange kind of horror, to look at oneself and realize there is no reason for being except the reasons one invents. He recalls a story from his childhood, how he once tried to imagine the universe stretching endlessly outward. The thought terrified him, not because of how large it was, but because it had no edge. Now, adulthood offers the same terror turned inward. The self, too, has no edge, no fixed center. It is an open field of possibilities, and that openness feels like falling. Freedom, he murmurs, is the space of nothingness between what I was and what I will be. That nothingness, he insists, is not emptiness. It is possibility, the raw material from which all meaning is made. But to live within it requires courage. It means giving up the hope that someone else will give life purpose. It means accepting that the universe is silent, and that its silence is an invitation, not a verdict. The paradox deepens. Man seeks meaning, yet meaning exists only because he seeks it. We are sculptors and clay at once. Every choice chisels us into form, but there is no guarantee of beauty, no promise of truth. And even worse, once a form is chosen, it hardens. The self we build becomes the cage we inhabit. Sartre senses this danger everywhere, in the way people speak of destiny, of vocation, of love as something meant to be. These phrases, though comforting, are escapes. They transform freedom into fate, responsibility into obedience. He calls it bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to avoid the pain of choice. But he will return to that idea later. For now, what grips him is the sheer, unbearable nakedness of existence itself. He thinks of the prisoner who dreams of freedom, believing it to be pure happiness. But once the gates open, a deeper anxiety begins. What now? What should I do with this freedom? It is the same question that plagues every life. After the revolution, after love, after success. Once the goal is reached, the burden of defining the next step returns. There is no final victory in the human condition, only an endless chain of choices. Each decision births another. Even refusing to choose is itself a choice. He writes in his notebook, "Man is a being whose existence comes before his essence, a being who must become what he is." The phrase still shocks him with its clarity. It means that the self is not a discovery, but a project. Something built, not found. And that project ends only in death. Until then, the blueprint keeps changing. But if existence precedes essence, what about morality? What keeps freedom from collapsing into chaos? Sartre answers in a single word: responsibility. Because each man, in choosing for himself, chooses for all. When you decide what is good for you, you affirm it as good for everyone. The weight of existence, then, is universal. You carry not only your own life, but the image of humanity that your actions project. This thought both humbles and terrifies him. It strips life of excuses. No culture, no nature, no instinct can speak in your place. There is only you, and the silent demand of the world that you decide what to do. Outside, a church bell rings in the distance. Sartre closes his notebook and listens. The bell once called people to worship, to kneel before something greater. Now it tolls across a city unsure of what it believes. He wonders if perhaps philosophy, too, is a kind of faith. Not in God, but in the possibility of meaning despite his absence. The light fades. Evening draws long shadows across the floor. He feels the exhaustion of thought settling over him, but there is also a strange calm, like the stillness that follows a confession. To admit the weight of existence is painful, but it is also honest. There is purity in seeing the world without illusions, in accepting that life owes you nothing and still choosing to live it fully. He walks again to the window. Paris glows faintly under the blackout curtains, a city both asleep and awake. Somewhere below, a couple argues, a child laughs, a siren wails. Life continues, absurd, persistent, unfinished. And Sartre feels, perhaps for the first time, that this persistence is itself an answer. Existence has no meaning, yes, but it endures. It insists. It demands to be lived. Maybe that is enough. Maybe meaning is not something found at the end of the search, but something created in the act of searching. He smiles faintly. The philosopher who declared that life has no essence finds himself strangely comforted by its sheer presence. To exist, even in confusion, even in despair, is already to participate in creation. The blank page of the universe waits, and every heartbeat writes another line. As he extinguishes his cigarette, he thinks of all the people walking through the city tonight. Lovers, soldiers, refugees, each carrying the same invisible burden, to justify their existence without the promise of reward. None of them asked to be born, yet all of them must decide what being born will mean. That is the secret tragedy of freedom. It asks for courage before it offers peace. And so, the philosopher returns to his desk, knowing that the work is never done. The war outside will end one day, but the war within, the struggle to make sense of existence, will go on as long as there are minds to think and hearts to question. He writes one last line before the candle burns out. To be free is to bear the weight of the world, even when it feels too heavy for one soul. Then he closes the notebook. The smoke curls upward, and the city exhales into sleep. Night again, thick and airless, over Paris. The lamps burn low along Boulevard Saint-Germain, and Sartre walks alone beneath them, hands buried in his coat pockets. The city is quieter now, as if holding its breath. He hears his own footsteps and thinks of the phrase that will soon make him both famous and feared. Man is condemned to be free. Condemned. The word startles even him. Freedom is supposed to be a triumph, the final victory of the human spirit. Yet he cannot bring himself to speak of it without the chill of punishment. Because to be condemned is to be forced into something you did not choose. And that, precisely, is how he understands the human condition. We did not ask to exist. We woke one day to find ourselves here, in a body, in a history, in a time we never agreed to. And from that moment forward, we are responsible for everything that follows. He stops at a corner cafe, half empty at this hour, and sits outside with a cup of black coffee that tastes of iron and smoke. The waitress nods but says nothing. He feels the strange intimacy of solitude. Around him, life continues in miniature. A man lighting a cigarette, a couple whispering by the window, each lost in private dramas that no God observes. Freedom, he thinks, is not the power to do whatever one wants. It is the inescapable fact that one must always decide. There is no neutral ground. Even indecision is a decision, even silence a form of speech. The moment you are aware of yourself, you are already choosing what to believe, how to act, whether to turn away or engage. That is why freedom feels like condemnation. It cannot be refused. You are free, whether you wish to be or not. He remembers the prisoners he met during the war, men who longed for liberty, who swore that once outside they would live differently. Yet when freedom came, many were crushed by it. They discovered that the bars of the camp had at least absolved them of responsibility. Now, every direction was open, and none guaranteed meaning. The gates of liberation led not to paradise, but to vertigo. Sartre leans back and watches the smoke spiral from his cigarette. The ash trembles, collapses, vanishes. A small allegory for being itself. To exist is to burn through possibility, until only the memory of choice remains. He writes in his notebook later that night. Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. The phrasing is severe, but necessary. He wants to jolt the mind awake, to strip away every comfort that hides the nakedness of decision. Most philosophies, he thinks, try to reconcile man with the world, to tell him that his place makes sense, that his nature was meant to be. But existentialism does the opposite. It leaves man alone with himself. No divine order, no cosmic plan, no moral law written in the stars. Only the individual and the task of creating value through action. He knows critics will call this nihilism. It is not. It is the opposite. Nihilism says nothing matters. Sartre says everything does, because the meaning of everything depends on what we choose. The nihilist escapes responsibility by declaring life empty. The existentialist carries the burden of filling it. He returns to his flat and sits before the mirror again. The reflection stares back, tired, unremarkable. Yet, in that ordinary face lies an abyss. There is no essence behind the image, only the flux of choices that give it shape. He wonders how many times he has already betrayed himself, how many small compromises, small lies, have chipped away at authenticity. Freedom, he realizes, is not merely the right to act. It is the constant pressure to remain true to the self one claims to be. That pressure is relentless. It does not rest on Sundays. It follows him through lectures, through conversations, through love. In every moment, the question returns: am I acting as myself, or as the role I play to escape myself? Sometimes he envies the faithful. Belief offers boundaries. It tells you what to do. But he cannot go back. The death of God for him is not a slogan. It is a daily experience. A silence that never ends. And from within that silence arises the voice of freedom, whispering, "Choose." He recalls a night years earlier, walking with Simone de Beauvoir along the Seine. The moon was thin, the water black. They spoke about commitment, about whether love could survive without ownership. She argued that love should be an act of will, renewed each day, not a chain. He agreed, but felt again the weight of his own logic. Even love is a choice that must be chosen endlessly. Nothing is guaranteed, not even affection. The moment one stops choosing, it begins to die. How exhausting, he thinks, to live like this, and yet, how honest. Better the fatigue of freedom than the sleep of obedience. He begins to draft a passage for being and nothingness. The words flow like confession. In anguish, we become aware of our total freedom. And in this awareness, we recognize that we are the authors of our acts. Anguish, then, is not an illness to be cured, but a sign of awakening. It is the pulse of responsibility. The church bells sound midnight. He feels suddenly the enormity of it all. Millions of lives unfolding simultaneously, each bound by the same invisible sentence. A peasant in Poland, a soldier in Africa, a widow in London, each condemned to decide, each constructing humanity in miniature through the smallest gesture. The thought is both unbearable and sublime. He imagines, for a moment, what a world would look like if everyone truly accepted this. No gods, no masters, only people acting with full awareness of their power. It would be chaos, perhaps, but also creation. The planet remade daily by the sum of conscious wills. Perhaps that is too much to ask of flesh and blood. But philosophy, he reminds himself, is not about what men can bear. It is about what truth demands. He thinks of responsibility again. The word once meant obligation to others. Now it means authorship. You are responsible for yourself because you wrote yourself. And yet, you write in a shared language. Every word you choose echoes in others. Freedom is therefore never private. It is the silent contract between every human consciousness. Outside, the wind picks up, scattering papers across the desk. He gathers them, smiling faintly. The universe is indifferent to his ideas. But that indifference no longer frightens him. It confirms what he already knows. Meaning will not descend from the sky. It must rise from within. He walks to the balcony. The streets are empty, the air cold. In the distance, faint gunfire cracks across the river. Even war, he thinks, is a form of choice. A collective abdication of responsibility disguised as obedience. But he will not let that comfort anyone. To obey is still to decide to obey. There are no innocent hands in history. Freedom, then, is a curse because it exposes guilt where we hoped for innocence. Every man becomes judge and prisoner in the same trial. The only absolution is authenticity, to act as one believes, knowing that belief itself has no guarantee. He exhales, the smoke drifts into darkness. Somewhere below, a cat cries, and the city shivers. He whispers to no one. We are alone, and it is enough. For the first time, he feels what his philosophy truly means. Not an idea, but a sensation. The immense solitude of being human. Yet beneath that solitude, something stirs. A fierce tenderness for the world, precisely because it depends on us. If freedom is a curse, it is also the only proof that we exist. Sartre returns inside, closes the window, and sits again before his pages. The candle trembles. He writes the final words for the night. There is no destiny. There is only the moment when a man decides what destiny will mean. He sets down the pen. Outside, dawn begins its slow return, indifferent but constant. The philosopher closes his eyes, knowing that with every sunrise the sentence is renewed. And humanity, once again, is condemned to be free. Morning again, thin light cutting through the curtains. Sartre wakes late, the air in the room thick with yesterday's smoke. For a moment, the philosopher forgets where he is, caught between dream and consciousness, that delicate space where thought has not yet hardened into words. And then, the realization returns. Slow and heavy as gravity itself, another day means another set of choices, another burden of freedom. He sits up and stares at the notebook on his desk. Its pages are full, yet unfinished. He feels the quiet pressure of his own ideas waiting to be lived, not just written. For all his talk of freedom, Sartre knows how easily one slips back into routine, into the illusion that life unfolds on its own. But it never does. Every gesture, every silence, every glance is a decision. Even doing nothing, he reminds himself, is an act with consequences. This is the heart of what he calls anguish, the anxiety that comes when one sees clearly that there is no map, no guiding hand, no excuse left to hide behind. When you understand that you alone must choose, and that your choice will echo beyond yourself, a kind of vertigo opens in the soul. He remembers the story of a young student who once sought his advice during the war. The boy's father supported the collaborationist regime, while his brother had joined the resistance. Torn between loyalty and conviction, the student came to Sartre in despair. "What should I do?" he asked. Sartre's answer was merciless in its honesty. "You must choose." There was no moral law to consult, no universal formula to calculate the good. To decide was to create the good, not to discover it. The student's anguish, Sartre explained, was proof of his freedom. And that freedom, though terrifying, was the only dignity man possesses. The world wants certainty, Sartre thought, not freedom. It wants rules, doctrines, instructions, anything to escape the silence of responsibility. The priest says, obey God. The state says, serve the nation. The scientist says, follow reason. But beneath all these voices lies a deeper one, quieter and more demanding. Decide for yourself. He lights a cigarette, inhales and exhales the thought with the smoke. Anxiety, he writes, is not a sickness to cure, but a signal. The mind awakening to its own power. When you feel anxiety before a choice, it is not weakness, it is the sound of freedom knocking. He thinks of Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who first called this feeling the dizziness of freedom. Sartre feels a kinship with him, though their conclusions differ. Kierkegaard saw anguish as the prelude to faith, the point where man surrenders to God. Sartre, standing in a godless world, can surrender only to himself. He must transform anguish into action. But that transformation is never simple. Freedom is a paradox. The more aware you are of it, the heavier it becomes. People think they want freedom, but most want reassurance. They want to be told what the right choice is so they can avoid blame. Sartre sees this everywhere, in politics, in religion, even in love. We cling to systems, to habits, to other people, not out of affection, but out of fear. We want someone else to carry the burden of deciding. He writes, "To choose oneself is to choose all men." It is one of his most difficult sentences, even for himself to accept. What he means is that every personal choice implies a vision of what it means to be human. To act selfishly is to declare that selfishness defines man. To act courageously is to affirm courage as a universal possibility. Each act radiates outward, shaping the moral landscape for others to inhabit. That is why anguish never ends, because every decision, however small, participates in the creation of the world. He rises and walks outside. The street smells of damp stone and bread. Children run past with school bags, laughing, unaware of the philosopher watching them like a ghost. They are still innocent, he thinks, still living inside the illusion that life happens. Soon they will learn that life does not happen. It is made. At the corner, he buys a newspaper. The front page speaks of battles, arrests, executions. Each event, each order, the result of someone's choice. Someone, somewhere, decided that this was necessary. The thought nauseates him. Evil, he realizes, is rarely born from hatred alone. It is born from the refusal to see freedom for what it is. It is born from obedience disguised as duty. He folds the paper and throws it in a bin. The weight in his chest grows heavier, but it is not despair. It is awareness. Awareness of the vast web of decisions binding every life to every other. At a cafe table, he begins to write again. His pen moves quickly, as if chasing a thought that might vanish. He describes man as a being for itself, a consciousness always aware of its own incompleteness. To be conscious is to stand apart from oneself, to know that one is not yet what one will be. This gap, this distance between what we are and what we could be, is the birthplace of anxiety. He pauses and lets the idea sink in. If man ever stopped feeling that distance, he would cease to be human. He would be an object, fixed, complete, dead. So perhaps anxiety, far from being a flaw, is the very proof of life. He writes another line. Anguish is the price we pay for being greater than what we are. Evening settles over the city again. The cafe lights glow amber, reflections dancing on the wet pavement. Sartre watches strangers pass, each carrying their invisible universe of doubts and choices. He wonders how many of them will ever face the full truth of their freedom, and how many will spend their lives hiding from it. He thinks of Simone de Beauvoir again. She, more than anyone, understands this weight. Their love, if it can be called that, is not built on comfort, but on recognition. They do not belong to each other. They choose each other, again and again, each day. And that choice, precisely because it is free, is also fragile. Freedom makes love beautiful, but it also makes it uncertain. He feels a strange tenderness as he writes about it. Not sentimentality, but respect. To love freely is to love without guarantees. To accept that the person beside you could walk away, and that your connection exists only because both will sustain it. It is not romantic, it is heroic. The philosopher finishes his coffee and steps outside. The air bites colder now. He walks along the river, his thoughts circling like birds above the dark water. Freedom, anguish, choice. These words follow him everywhere, whispering like ghosts. But tonight, something shifts. For the first time, he feels not crushed, but steadied by them. The anxiety of choice will never disappear, but perhaps that is the point. It is not a defect of the human condition. It is the pulse that keeps it alive. He stops on the bridge and looks out over the Seine. The reflections tremble in the current, breaking and reforming endlessly. Perhaps that, he thinks, is what freedom looks like. Not a steady flame, but a flickering one, fragile, unstable, yet always capable of lighting the dark. He smiles faintly, and in the half-light whispers to himself, "To choose is to exist. To exist is to tremble." Then he turns, walks back into the city, and disappears into the hum of Paris. Another man condemned to decide, yet still daring to choose. Morning sunlight crawls across the small cafe table, turning the surface of Sartre's coffee into a dull mirror. He watches the waiter move through the room, quick, graceful, efficient, as though each motion had been rehearsed. A nod here, a smile there, the flick of a cloth on a glass, the bow of the wrist when placing a saucer. To the customers, he is perfect, polite, precise, invisible. But to Sartre, he is the embodiment of a question that will haunt his philosophy. What does it mean to be what you are? He begins to observe him as one might observe a character in a play. The waiter performs his role with an almost theatrical devotion, every gesture exaggerated, every expression deliberate. His voice carries the warmth of hospitality, but his eyes are elsewhere, fixed on some private rhythm of duty. Sartre realizes that the man is not merely serving coffee, he is playing the waiter. That realization opens a door inside Sartre's thought. The man's movements, so exact and so empty, reveal the subtle tragedy of human behavior, the tendency to hide behind the mask of function. The waiter has become a symbol of all of us, of the ways we try to escape the trembling uncertainty of freedom by pretending that we are the roles we play. Sartre writes later, he is playing at being a waiter in a cafe, as if this were his fate and not his choice. The phrase will become one of the most famous in modern philosophy. But here, in the dim light of the cafe, it is not theory, it is observation. The waiter acts as though his essence were fixed, as though the universe had written into his nature the words, "You are a waiter." Yet Sartre knows that nothing in the universe has written anything at all. The man could walk out the door, quit his job, change his life, but he does not. He clings to his role because it shields him from the abyss of possibility. To play a part is easier than to exist freely. Sartre names this self-deception bad faith, mauvaise foi. It is the quiet lie we tell ourselves every day to escape the anxiety of choice. The waiter convinces himself that he is a waiter, and nothing more. The soldier believes he is a soldier by destiny. The mother tells herself she is defined by motherhood alone. And yet, beneath all those identities, consciousness whispers, "You are more than this." Bad faith is not hypocrisy. It is not a deliberate lie told to others. It is the subtler, more dangerous lie told to oneself, the lie that your freedom has limits. He remembers a conversation with Simone de Beauvoir the night before. They had argued about the nature of authenticity. "You speak of freedom as if it were pure," she said. "But even we live inside habits. Don't we wear masks too?" Sartre had smiled. "Of course," he answered, "but the difference is whether we know it." To be conscious of one's mask, to see the play as play, is the beginning of honesty. To forget the mask and call it truth, that is the birth of illusion. He looks again at the waiter. The man glides between tables, smiling at each customer with mechanical charm. His apron is spotless, his posture immaculate. Sartre feels a sudden pity for him, though it is the pity of recognition. They are not so different. Sartre too plays his roles: professor, writer, lover, intellectual, and each carries its own costume. To the world, he is Jean-Paul Sartre, philosopher. But beneath that title lives the same fragile consciousness, uncertain, improvising, terrified of its own power. He scribbles a note on the napkin. The waiter believes he is what he does. I am afraid I do the same. The idea grows darker as he walks home. He begins to see masks everywhere. In the soldier saluting without conviction. In the couple smiling through quiet resentment. In the priest performing ritual prayers with mechanical faith. Each gesture is a defense against nothingness. Each role is a wall built against the truth that no essence defines us. Freedom, Sartre thinks, is not only the burden of choosing, but also the courage to admit that the choice is yours. Most people, faced with this, retreat. They cling to their professions, their relationships, their nationalities, their beliefs, as though these could grant them identity. They say, I cannot act otherwise. This is who I am. But in truth, they could act otherwise. They always could. That is the unbearable secret of consciousness. He stops by the river, leaning against the stone parapet. The water glimmers faintly beneath the bridge. He wonders what it would mean to live without masks, to act without pretending that any role could define you. It would mean living with constant uncertainty. Yes, but also with absolute honesty. To say, I am what I do now, and nothing more. It is terrifying, but it is real. In Being and Nothingness, he will write, man is not what he is, and he is what he is not. At first it sounds like paradox, but it is simply the truth of consciousness. We are always escaping the moment, always projecting ourselves toward what we are yet to become. The waiter who says, I am a waiter, freezes himself into an object, a thing among things. But consciousness is never a thing. It is an opening, a movement, a negation of what already is. To live authentically, then, is to refuse to become a thing. It is to embrace the tension between being and becoming, to act with awareness that you could have acted otherwise. Freedom in this sense is not an achievement but a practice, a daily refusal to hide behind certainty. As he crosses the bridge, Sartre recalls his own time in the army, how easy it had been to surrender thought, to become a soldier. He had followed orders, marched, saluted, obeyed, and in doing so, felt strangely calm. The anxiety vanished because responsibility had been outsourced. Only later, when the illusion cracked, did he understand the cost of that calm. To renounce freedom is to renounce humanity itself. The wind off the Seine chills his face. He buttons his coat and keeps walking, haunted by the figure of the waiter who does not know he is acting. The metaphor will stay with him for years, not as condemnation, but as warning. Because every time a man forgets he is free, the world grows a little more mechanical, a little more cruel. At home, he sits by the dim lamp and begins to write again. The words come fast, almost fevered. We run away from freedom because we fear its responsibility. But in doing so, we create our own prisons. Prisons made of roles, rules, and routines. He underlines the sentence twice. Then softer, he adds, to live without bad faith is not to escape roles, but to see them for what they are. Choices, not chains. He pauses, exhausted, and glances at the clock. Nearly midnight. Outside, the streets are silent, except for a distant accordion somewhere across the square. He thinks of the waiter again, closing the café, wiping the last table, locking the door. Perhaps, he muses. The man feels relief at the end of his shift. The brief moment when he can stop playing. Or perhaps the mask has sunk so deep that he no longer knows where it ends and where he begins. Sartre closes his notebook and leans back in the chair. A thought surfaces, quiet but insistent. Maybe freedom is not about removing masks, but about remembering that you wear them. To see clearly, even through the disguise. That, too, is authenticity. He finishes his cigarette, stubs it out, and whispers to himself. The waiter plays his role perfectly. The tragedy is that he believes the play is real. Then he smiles, a tired, private smile, and blows out the lamp. The room falls into darkness, and, for a moment, so does the world. A stage emptied of actors waiting for the next performance of freedom to begin. Night settles over Paris like dust. The hum of the cafés fades, the last trams groan along their rails, and the streets fall into a silence thick enough to think in. Sartre sits by the window, notebook open, cigarette between his fingers. The smoke twists slowly upward, fragile and temporary, a perfect metaphor for consciousness. He is writing about bad faith now, that quiet betrayal of the self that lies at the heart of everyday life. The concept has haunted him since the day he watched the waiter perform his role so perfectly. But it goes deeper than a single metaphor. It reaches into every conversation, every compromise, every half-truth that allows people to live without confronting their freedom. Sartre begins with a simple conviction. Man is free, always, even in chains. But freedom is heavy, and most cannot bear its weight for long. So they pretend. They pretend they are not free. They pretend their lives are determined by their job, their nature, their past, their love, their country, their God. This pretense is not mere ignorance. It is bad faith, the deliberate self-deception that says, I am not responsible because I had no choice. He knows this lie intimately. He has seen it in others and in himself. The teacher who says, I must teach, it is my calling. The lover who says, I cannot help it, my heart decides for me. The citizen who says, I only follow orders. Each of these statements hides the same trembling fear, the fear of responsibility. To admit that one could have acted differently is to stand naked before the abyss of choice. Sartre leans back and lets the cigarette burn. Outside, the wind knocks faintly against the glass. He writes, bad faith is not a defect in logic. It is a choice to lie to oneself in order to escape anguish. That word again, anguish. It returns like a refrain in everything he writes. Bad faith is its opposite. Where anguish reveals freedom, bad faith conceals it. It is a kind of sleep, a moral anesthesia. And yet, without it, perhaps few could endure the constant pressure of existence. He thinks of a woman he once knew, elegant, intelligent, endlessly polite. She would spend hours talking about love, insisting she sought sincerity above all. Yet when a man she desired placed his hand over hers, she would leave it there, motionless, pretending not to notice. She wanted both to acknowledge and to deny the gesture, to suspend the moment between decision and refusal. Sartre saw in her the essence of bad faith. The refusal to define oneself, the will to remain in between, to avoid choosing. He writes the example in Being and Nothingness, not out of cruelty, but out of precision. The woman at the cafe becomes a mirror in which every reader can see their own hesitation. We have all done this, he thinks, allowed the moment to decide for us, so that later we can say, it just happened. Nothing ever just happens. Someone always chooses, even if that someone is silence. He takes a long drag from the cigarette and exhales slowly. The room fills with a thin gray cloud. But for a moment, he sees his reflection in the window, blurred, ghostly, divided between inside and outside. He wonders whether the philosopher, too, lives in bad faith. Writing about authenticity does not make one authentic. He too plays his role, the thinker, the rebel, the voice of freedom. Is there not a kind of pride in that? A subtle pleasure in being Sartre the existentialist? He knows the danger. To identify with the mask is the first step towards sleep. Freedom, he reminds himself, must be renewed constantly. There is no once and for all awakening. Even enlightenment can become a costume if one forgets to question it. He stands, restless, and walks to the kitchen. The tap drips rhythmically, a metronome for thought. He pours a glass of water, cold and metallic, and leans against the counter. It occurs to him that bad faith is not only personal. Entire societies live within it. Nations pretend they are guided by destiny rather than ambition. Armies pretend they kill for peace. Churches pretend doubt does not exist. Every collective illusion begins with individuals who have forgotten their freedom. He returns to the desk and writes faster now, almost angrily. When we hide behind roles, we deny our own humanity. We become objects among objects, gears in a machine of lies. But even anger cannot erase compassion. Sartre does not hate those who live in bad faith. He understands them. He understands the exhaustion of being awake in a world that constantly tempts you to sleep. To live authentically is to live in permanent tension between what you are and what you could be, between action and possibility, between comfort and truth. He writes, "The moment we say, 'I had no choice,' we lie, not to others, but to ourselves. And in that lie, we lose the only dignity we possess." He thinks again of Beauvoir, her presence, her intellect, her fierce clarity. She too wrestles with these questions. What it means to live truthfully, to love without possession, to write without illusion. Together, they have built a life based not on vows, but on constant renewal. Every day, they choose to remain, and in that choice lies their freedom. It is not an easy love, but it is real. Outside, the church bells strike midnight. The sound echoes through the streets like a reminder from another world, a world that still believes in absolution. Sartre listens, but does not pray. For him, there is no forgiveness waiting beyond the self. The only redemption lies in honesty, in seeing clearly, even when it hurts. He looks down at his notes, the page filled with sharp black lines. He underlines a passage twice. Bad faith is the denial of freedom in the name of peace. There it is, distilled to its core. Peace at the cost of truth. Tranquility bought with the coin of self-deception. He wonders how many people die every day without ever realizing they were free. He remembers the camp again, the soldiers, the fences, the illusion that freedom ends at the boundary of barbed wire. But he had seen men resist even there, not with guns or escape plans, but with small acts of will. A glance, a shared loaf of bread, a refusal to betray. These gestures were invisible to history, but they were the purest form of authenticity. Even in captivity, man remains free, free to decide how he will bear his captivity. Sartre closes his notebook, the ink still wet. He whispers to himself, "Perhaps the real prison is the one we build from lies." He walks to the window again. The city lies motionless beneath the stars, each light a small defiance against the dark. He feels a strange calm, though not comfort. Bad faith will never vanish. It is the shadow cast by freedom itself. Wherever there is choice, there will be fear. And where there is fear, there will be the temptation to hide. But perhaps the point is not to eliminate bad faith, only to recognize it, to wake from it, again and again, like a man refusing to stay asleep. He crushes the last cigarette into the ashtray. The room is quiet now. He writes one final sentence before bed, a sentence that will remain unedited in his book. To live without bad faith is not to live without error, but to live without excuses. He sets down the pen. The city exhales. Somewhere, the waiter locks the door of the cafe. The woman walks home beneath the lamps. The soldiers change their posts, each of them dreaming perhaps that they are what they seem. Each of them free, though they may never know it. Sartre blows out the candle. In the dark, the faint glow of the ember lingers a moment longer, then disappears. But the smoke, invisible now, still moves through the air, reminding him that even in silence, consciousness continues to breathe. The theater is small, almost claustrophobic. A single set, 3 chairs, 1 locked door. The audience sits in uneasy silence as the curtain rises. On stage, 3 characters enter: a journalist, a postal clerk, and a socialite. None of them know why they are here. They have just died, and this room, bare, windowless, timeless, is to be their eternity. There are no flames, no devils, no instruments of torture. Only conversation. This is Sartre's play, No Exit, written in the thick air of the war years, when death was a daily headline and existence itself seemed provisional. He intended it as more than drama. It was philosophy performed, a vision of the afterlife as a mire for the living. The line that would echo through the century comes near the end. Hell is other people. It is perhaps the most misunderstood sentence he ever wrote. Many took it as misanthropy, as if Sartre were saying that people are unbearable, that solitude is bliss, but the meaning is deeper and darker. For Sartre, hell is not other people themselves, but the way we allow their gaze to define us. He sits in his apartment one evening, thinking back to the moment he first wrote the line. He remembers the heat of the stage lights, the smell of paint and dust. The 3 characters circle one another like mirrors, each seeing themselves reflected through the other's judgments. They beg, flatter, accuse, seduce, desperate to escape the image the others impose. And the terrible irony is that they cannot. This, Sartre realized, is the everyday condition of human life. We live in the eyes of others. The waiter, the lover, the philosopher, all are trapped by the same invisible audience. Each seeks validation, each dreads rejection, and each becomes a prisoner of perception. When the waitress smiles, she does not simply smile, she becomes the one who smiles. When the writer publishes, he becomes the one who must write. Our identities crystallize in the reflections cast by others, and soon we forget they were ever reflections. The gaze, Sartre writes, turns a subject into an object. Under its weight, consciousness hardens. You feel yourself observed, measured, fixed. You begin to act not as you are, but as you appear. The self becomes performance. Life becomes theater. He remembers a childhood moment, being caught peeking through a keyhole. The instant he heard footsteps behind him, shame surged like fire. It was not the act itself that burned, but the sudden realization of being seen. That was the birth of the look. Under another's gaze, the world tilts. One becomes both oneself and something alien. An image projected, a creature judged. It is a simple truth with infinite consequences. It means we exist for ourselves, but also for others, and these two existences never fully align. He turns the thought in his mind like a coin. To live authentically, then, must mean acknowledging the gaze without surrendering to it. But how difficult that is, to see oneself through others' eyes and still remain free. Most people do not even notice the transformation. They slip quietly into the identities others assign: the obedient son, the loyal friend, the respectable citizen. They become, as he once wrote, captives of their reflection. The play's characters embody this perfectly. Garcon, the journalist, longs to prove he is brave, yet every gesture is shaped by the fear of cowardice. Estelle, the socialite, needs the admiration of others to believe she exists at all. Inez, the postal clerk, seeks control, manipulating the others to preserve her sense of self. Together, they form a triangle of dependence, each defining the others, each suffocating in the very need to be seen. There are no mirrors in the room, Sartre noted, because the true mirror is the gaze of the other. That is hell, an eternity of being looked at, unable to escape the image others hold of you. But even this hell, Sartre insists, is of our own making. We give others the power to define us. We accept their gaze as truth. Freedom remains, always, in the refusal to be reduced to what others see. He remembers once walking through a crowd after a lecture. Faces turned toward him, admiration, curiosity, skepticism. He felt for a moment like an actor trapped in his own mythology. Sartre, the existentialist. The label stuck to him like a skin. He smiled, shook hands, played the part. But inside he felt the unease that always accompanies being seen. Perhaps this, too, was a small version of hell. Later that night, he tells Beauvoir that fame is another kind of prison. She laughs softly. Then we must use the bars to climb, she says. Her words linger. Perhaps the point is not to avoid the gaze, but to transform it, to meet it with awareness, to use it as material rather than fate. He writes, "The other is the one who robs me of my being by making me an object, yet also the one through whom I recognize myself as free." The paradox is inescapable. Without others, we would not exist as selves at all. The gaze that imprisons also confirms that we are real. It is both poison and proof. He considers love again. Love, too, is built upon the gaze. We want to be loved freely, but also completely. We want the other's freedom to choose us, but we also want to possess that freedom. Thus, love becomes a dance of contradiction. Two consciousnesses trying to hold one another without turning each other into objects. When it fails, it curdles into jealousy, domination, despair. When it succeeds, it is fragile, fleeting, miraculous. The bells outside toll midnight. Sartre closes his notebook and stands at the window. The city glimmers. Thousands of lights, thousands of rooms, each containing its own small theater of gazes. A mother watching her child, a lover studying a face in sleep, a stranger catching his reflection in a store window. Each scene repeats the same drama, the self seeking itself in another's eyes. Hell is other people, he whispers, and then, after a pause, but heaven is other people too. Because without others, there is no dialogue, no recognition, no art, no history. The gaze that confines also creates the bridge between worlds. The problem is not the existence of others, but our submission to their vision of us. Freedom, once again, demands awareness. The courage to say, "You see me, but I am more than what you see." He sits again and writes in the margin, "Freedom begins where the gaze ends." Yet he knows the gaze never truly ends. Even now, long after the theater has closed, he can feel it. Invisible, relentless, shaping him as he writes. The reader who will one day open this book will also look at him, will imagine his face, will define him again. There is no escaping the circle, only understanding it. The candle flickers low. He remembers the final scene of No Exit. The three damned souls laugh hysterically as they realize the door will never open. Their punishment is not torture, but eternity in each other's presence, condemned to see and be seen forever. And yet, within that laughter, Sartre senses something strange: acceptance. The characters recognize their condition at last. Perhaps that recognition itself is a form of freedom. He closes his eyes and imagines the stage going dark. The line echoes once more, not as despair, but as revelation. Hell is other people, because through them, we learn what hell we make of ourselves. When he opens his eyes, the sky outside is pale. Dawn, again. He feels the weariness of thought, but also its quiet satisfaction. Every question opens another. Every insight, another uncertainty. But that is the rhythm of existence. He writes one last note before the light swallows the night. We cannot escape the eyes of others, but we can refuse to die in their gaze. Then he sets down the pen and breathes deeply. The room smells of smoke and ink and morning. Somewhere far away, another curtain rises, another performance begins, and the philosopher, still awake, watches the world play out the same eternal scene of freedom, shame, and recognition. The winter of 1940 froze Paris in silence. German soldiers marched through the boulevards, their boots echoing against stone, a metronome of occupation. The cafés stayed open, but the laughter was quieter, the conversation shorter, the glances more careful. For Jean-Paul Sartre, the war was not just a political catastrophe, it was the crucible in which his philosophy would harden into something unbreakable. He had volunteered as a meteorologist in the French army, a strange post for a philosopher, but one that suited his temperament. The weather, unpredictable, impersonal, beyond human control, mirrored the chaos he saw unfolding in Europe. Yet even in this absurd assignment, Sartre sensed that choice still mattered. You could not control the wind, but you could decide what to do beneath it. In 1940, he was captured by German forces and sent to a prison camp near Trier. The camp was called Stalag Dau 3D. Thousands of men shared the same gray monotony, fences, mud, and the endless counting of days. But inside that confinement, Sartre discovered a paradox, that freedom was not a matter of space, but of consciousness. He wrote later that his captivity was the moment he truly understood freedom. Stripped of everything, books, friends, purpose, he realized that the last possession left to him was choice. You could obey or resist, despair or hope, share your bread or keep it. Even the smallest gesture became proof of autonomy. The guards could order his body, but his mind remained ungoverned. Each morning, he watched the prisoners shuffle into lines, their eyes dulled by repetition. Some retreated into memory, others into hatred. A few joked to survive. Sartre observed, listened, wrote fragments on scraps of paper. The camp for him became a living experiment in the meaning of existence. Here were men reduced to bare life, yet still capable of deciding who they would be in the face of nothingness. He once saw a prisoner risk punishment to help an old man carry a bucket of water across the yard. The act was simple, but it glowed with significance. It was a refusal, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of dehumanization. In that gesture, Sartre saw the essence of his emerging philosophy. Man is condemned to be free, but through that condemnation, he creates his own dignity. Freedom was not absence of constraint. It was the courage to act meaningfully within constraint. When the camp's gates finally opened a year later, and he returned to Paris, the world had changed. Or perhaps he had. The city was bruised and hungry, its people half ghosts moving through the occupation. Yet to Sartre, everything now shimmered with the unbearable clarity of consciousness. There were no neutral acts anymore. Every word, every silence, every collaboration or resistance was a declaration of being. He began to write being and nothingness almost immediately. The pages poured out of him like confession. He described consciousness as nothingness, a gap between what is and what could be. And this gap was the birthplace of freedom. To exist, he said, is to stand perpetually between the world and its meaning, forever responsible for the bridge we build between them. The war had made that bridge visible. It stripped away illusion. No one could claim ignorance anymore. You either chose or you were chosen by your refusal to choose. He met Beauvoir again at Café de Flore, where the resistance whispered in corners and German officers drank obliviously nearby. She noticed the change in him, the sharper gaze, the harder tone. "You've stopped being a professor," she said. "You've become something else." He smiled. "A witness, perhaps," he answered. "Or an accomplice who refuses to stay quiet." Together, they resolved to make philosophy a weapon, not of violence, but of awakening. They would write, teach, and speak of freedom as responsibility, not luxury. Every article they published under occupation risked censorship or arrest, but to remain silent would have been worse. In silence, bad faith breeds. Sartre joined an underground group called Socialisme et Liberté, distributing pamphlets that argued for intellectual resistance. He did not believe in passive philosophy. Thought, he insisted, must act. To think, he told his students later, is already to take sides. One cold night, while curfew sirens howled, he stood by his window watching the searchlights sweep across the rooftops. He imagined the city as a single living organism, terrified, trembling, yet still breathing. For the first time, he felt not despair, but solidarity. Freedom was not only an individual burden, it was a shared one. He began to understand that freedom, while inescapable, is also relational. Every choice reshapes the field of possibilities for others. The man who collaborates narrows the horizon of his neighbor. The man who resists expands it. To choose for oneself is to choose for all. A thought that had once been abstract now pulsed with blood and consequence. In those years, Sartre also learned something humbler, that freedom without empathy curdles into arrogance. He had watched intellectuals justify cowardice as realism. Revolutionaries justify cruelty as necessity. The war taught him that authenticity must be paired with compassion, that to claim freedom while ignoring the suffering of others is another form of bad faith. He would later write, "Every man who becomes aware of his own freedom discovers that he is responsible for all men." The awakening was not triumphant. It was painful, like eyes adjusting to harsh light. Sartre saw clearly that most people did not want this kind of freedom. They wanted peace, order, the comfort of being told what to do. Even after liberation, France would search for new certainties, new gods, new ideologies, anything to escape the nakedness of responsibility. But Sartre could no longer unsee it. The war had burned away his naivety. Before it, he had thought of freedom as an abstract condition of human nature. After it, he understood freedom as an ethical demand, the obligation to act, to choose, to answer for one's existence. He and Beauvoir began to teach again. Students filled the lecture halls, hungry not for facts, but for meaning. They spoke of existence before essence, of authenticity, of the necessity to live deliberately. Some accused them of preaching despair. Sartre disagreed. Despair, he said, is not seeing the world without God. It is refusing to see that we can act in his absence. On summer evenings, he walked along the Seine, watching the lights flicker on the water. The air smelled of coal and possibility. For the first time, he felt that philosophy was no longer a spectator's sport. It was life itself, messy, dangerous, unfinished. In those walks, the memory of the camp returned often. He remembered the men who waited for rescue, and those who created their own freedom inside captivity. The difference between them was invisible from outside, but immense within. That difference, between submission and awareness, would define the rest of his life's work. He wrote in his journal, "Freedom begins the moment one refuses to lie to oneself, even in the smallest act." By the time the war ended, Sartre was no longer merely a writer or teacher. He had become a witness to what philosophy could mean when stripped of luxury, a kind of moral soldier, though his weapon was a pen. His words carried the weight of the camp, the occupation, the awakening that comes only when every illusion has been destroyed. He looked around at the rebuilding city, the scaffolds, the rubble, the quiet industry of survival, and realized that France itself mirrored his philosophy. It was condemned to freedom. The old structures had fallen, and nothing waited to replace them. Each citizen would have to choose what kind of nation to create, just as each person must choose what kind of self to become. One evening, as he walked home, a young man recognized him and said, "You make it sound so hard. This freedom." Sartre smiled faintly. "It is hard," he said, "but so is breathing. And yet we must." He paused on the bridge, the wind lifting his coat, and looked over the river that had seen empires rise and fall. The water carried reflections of lights, unstable, trembling, yet constant in their motion. Freedom, he thought, is like this river. It cannot be stopped, only directed. To deny it is to drown. To accept it is to flow. He whispered to himself, almost as prayer, "The war ended the world's illusions. What remains is choice." Then he turned from the river and walked into the noise of the city. A city waking from its long sleep. A philosopher reborn in the fire of history. The war was over, but the air still trembled with its ghosts. Paris carried a new kind of silence, the silence that follows survival. Bombed facades were patched with fresh plaster, cafés reopened, and young people spoke again of love, literature, and politics. Yet beneath the chatter ran a quiet unease. What now? After a war that had exposed the abyss of human choice, how was one to live? For Jean-Paul Sartre, the answer came not from solitude, but from companionship, from the one mind that had always met his as an equal, Simone de Beauvoir. Their partnership had begun long before the war, when they were still students in love with thought, more than with romance. They had made a pact that was radical for its time, a vow of honesty instead of fidelity, freedom instead of possession. They would love each other, but they would never lie to each other. They would choose each other, again and again, freely, without chains. The idea was beautiful, dangerous, and almost impossible. But it became the living laboratory for everything Sartre wrote about freedom. They met again in 1944 at Café de Flore, their familiar refuge. The city was half liberated, half starved. Sartre arrived with the tired confidence of a man who had seen the worst and survived it. Beauvoir, luminous and razor-sharp, greeted him with a smile that carried both relief and challenge. "So," she said, "now that we are free, what shall we do with it?" That question, half teasing, half serious, would define the rest of their lives. They spoke for hours that night, about the war, about the failure of institutions, about how people needed to learn to live without illusions. Beauvoir listened, then said quietly, "Freedom means nothing if it doesn't include the freedom of others." Sartre nodded, but her words lingered. They would return years later as the seed of her masterpiece, The Second Sex, and as the heart of his political awakening. Their love was not romantic in the traditional sense. It was philosophical, intellectual, and fiercely ethical. They refused the language of ownership. No, my love. No, forever. Each would have other lovers, other experiences. But beneath it all was an unspoken commitment to truth. They believed that love should never be a form of bad faith, never a mask to hide the loneliness of being free. At times it worked. At times it tore them apart. Freedom, they discovered, can be cruel when shared. The same principle that liberated them also forced them to face jealousy, insecurity, and the endless negotiation between self and other. Yet they accepted the pain as proof that the experiment mattered. To love another consciousness without absorbing it, that was the ultimate test of existential ethics. Beauvoir once wrote in her diary, "To will another's freedom is the only way to love." Sartre agreed. He had always believed that hell was the gaze of others, but through Beauvoir, he began to see that the gaze could also be grace, if it recognized freedom rather than confined it. Their public life grew as their private experiments continued. Together, they edited Le Temps Moderne, a magazine that would become the voice of post-war intellectual France. They debated Marxists, defended artists, supported revolutions abroad. Every essay, every argument, was a continuation of their dialogue, the same one that had begun in cafés years before. They were no longer lovers hiding from the world. They had become a phenomenon, a living symbol of the existential generation. But behind the legend was something quieter, more human. Beauvoir grounded Sartre's abstractions in lived experience. Where he dissected freedom in theoretical language, she showed its flesh and blood. Her students, her readers, her letters, all revealed a woman wrestling with the same contradictions he wrote about. The conflict between autonomy and attachment, between authenticity and tenderness. She would later say that their love was not a union, but a crossing of paths. Two travelers walking parallel roads toward the same horizon. Sometimes close, sometimes far, but always aware of each other's presence. For Sartre, Beauvoir's influence was not simply emotional, it was structural. She was proof that freedom was not a solitary burden, but a shared one. He began to see that the self only becomes real through relationship. The other, once his symbol of imprisonment, could also be a mirror that reflected possibility. One evening, they sat by the river, watching the lights shimmer on the water. The war felt distant now, but its lessons had not faded. Sartre spoke about responsibility. Beauvoir listened, then interrupted. "You speak of freedom as if it were a mountain to climb. But what if it is a bridge we build together?" He smiled, realizing she had found the metaphor he'd been searching for. "Yes," he said. "Freedom is not what separates us, it's what connects us." That conversation would mark the quiet turning point in his thought. From individual freedom to collective freedom. It was no longer enough to say that each person must choose. One must also recognize that choices intertwine. Freedom, in the end, means building a world where others can be free too. Their shared philosophy unfolded in gestures as small as their daily routines. Sartre wrote at dawn, Beauvoir corrected proofs at noon. They would meet in the evening to talk, argue, and laugh. Sometimes they worked in silence, each lost in thought, yet their silence was companionable. Two minds facing the same void without fear. But even this partnership carried its shadows. Beauvoir's letters reveal moments of deep loneliness. Sartre's journals confess fatigue, guilt, and confusion. They were explorers of moral wilderness, and sometimes the terrain cut them open. Still, neither turned back. To remain together by choice, renewed each day, was itself the affirmation of their belief. Love, Sartre once said to her, is not a state, it is a verb. He meant it literally. To love is to act, to choose the other anew, knowing the choice is fragile and may fail. It is not a feeling that protects you from freedom. It is the act that teaches you how to live with it. In the years after the war, their names became inseparable from the idea of existentialism. Students packed lecture halls, reporters followed them through cafés, tourists photographed the table where they wrote. Yet fame, too, became another test of authenticity. The world wanted idols, not philosophers. Sartre despised the idea of being a monument. Beauvoir warned him, "If we let them turn us into statues, they'll stop hearing what we say." So they kept moving, from Paris to Rome, from conferences to protests, refusing to settle into the roles others cast for them. Even their public image, with its contradictions and rumors, became part of the same experiment. Living openly, refusing disguise. What sustained them was not serenity, but movement, the continual renewal of thought and choice. They quarreled, reconciled, drifted apart, and returned. They read each other's manuscripts with brutal honesty. They exposed their flaws, their infidelities, their doubts. Nothing was hidden because concealment was the beginning of bad faith. Through it all, Beauvoir remained his greatest critic and his greatest ally. She sharpened his ideas, expanded them, and sometimes overturned them. If Sartre gave philosophy its raw language of freedom, Beauvoir gave it a human face. She wrote of women, of aging, of the body, of how history carves itself into flesh. Her work showed that freedom is not only a matter of thought, but of circumstance. That to will freedom, one must fight for it in the world. Sartre never forgot that lesson. When he saw her write The Second Sex, he recognized that her courage had surpassed his own. She had taken existentialism out of the café and into the lives of millions of women who had been told they were less than free. He admired her for it, though it made him question the limits of his own philosophy. One winter evening, long after midnight, he watched her sleeping, her face half lit by the street lamp outside. He thought of all the years they had shared, the books, the laughter, the arguments. He felt the weight of his own aging body, the tremor in his hands. Freedom, he knew, had never been easy, but it had been real. And in her presence, it had become bearable. He whispered softly, not to wake her. To choose you was to choose the world. Because in choosing her, freely, deliberately, without illusion, he had chosen to believe that freedom could be shared, that two consciousnesses could meet without consuming each other, that love, stripped of ownership, could still endure. He turned back to his desk and wrote the final line of the day. Freedom is not solitude. It is the space between two beings who recognize each other as free. Outside, Paris was quiet again. The city had learned to breathe after war, and so had they. Two philosophers, two lives intertwined, not bound by vows, but by the courage to face the nothingness together. And in that shared nothingness, something eternal flickered, not certainty, not peace, but the fragile, luminous truth that freedom, when given, multiplies. The war had ended, but the question it left behind had not. What does one do with freedom once it's undeniable? The cafes buzzed again, the theaters reopened, the city danced to jazz and cigarettes. Yet Sartre felt a different rhythm beneath the surface, a quiet drumbeat of guilt. He saw it everywhere, in the eyes of those who had collaborated, in the silence of those who had done nothing, in his own uneasy reflection. Paris was rebuilding its walls, but not yet its conscience. He began to write obsessively about responsibility. If freedom was the essence of existence, then responsibility was its shadow. The proof that freedom was real. Without it, freedom became mere whim, a hollow gesture of ego. With it, every act carried the weight of the world. He would tell his students later, "When you choose for all mankind." It was not rhetoric. He meant it literally. Every decision, Sartre argued, affirms a value. When you act, even privately, even in despair, you declare what kind of human being you believe humans should be. To steal, to lie, to remain silent, each becomes a statement about the human condition. In this sense, no act is isolated. We are all legislators in an invisible parliament, drafting laws through our behavior. He knew this was a heavy idea, too heavy for most, but he refused to soften it. The horrors of the war had taught him that denying responsibility was the root of every atrocity. I was just following orders. I had no choice. It wasn't my fault. Those phrases were the music of moral sleep. And to Sartre, sleep was the enemy of freedom. He wrote in Being and Nothingness, "In choosing for myself, I choose for all men." The line would haunt him for the rest of his life. He and Beauvoir often debated it late into the night. She would challenge him gently. "You make man sound like Atlas, condemned to carry the earth on his shoulders. But most people can barely carry themselves." Sartre would smile, exhausted. "Yes," he said, "but that is the human condition, to carry what crushes you." They both knew it was true. Responsibility was not meant to be comfortable. It was the price of consciousness. One afternoon, walking along the Boulevard Saint-Michel, Sartre stopped to watch a street painter at work. The man's clothes were torn, his hands shaking slightly from cold or hunger. Yet, with each brushstroke, he was utterly absorbed. Sartre envied that intensity, the purity of doing without illusion. The painter was responsible only for the next line of color, but in that moment, he embodied what Sartre called authentic action, awareness united with creation. Authenticity was not a state of grace. It was an ongoing task. To be authentic was not to be pure, but to be awake. It meant acting without pretending that your actions were dictated by something outside yourself. Not by God, not by fate, not by history. He saw how rarely people achieved it. Even revolutionaries, he noticed, often acted as if their cause absolved them. They shifted responsibility from themselves to history, as if violence and betrayal were justified by some grand necessity. Sartre despised that. "The moment you say history demands this," he wrote, "you have already begun to betray freedom." To him, morality was never about obedience. It was about authorship. There were no divine laws to consult, no cosmic judge to forgive. Each person had to write the law in real time, through their actions. The act itself became the meaning. This burden could paralyze, and Sartre knew it. He felt it in himself, the vertigo of infinite responsibility. Sometimes, he would sit motionless for hours, staring at his papers, unable to begin. The thought pressed on him that whatever he wrote would not just reflect him, but shape others. "Every word," he said, "is an act." It was both inspiration and curse. At night, he would walk through Saint-Germain-des-Prés, past couples laughing under street lamps, and feel the absurdity of it all, that a species of fragile, finite creatures could be entrusted with the weight of meaning. But then he would remember the camp, the prisoners, the man who had carried the bucket of water. If freedom was unbearable, responsibility was the way to bear it. He began lecturing again at the Sorbonne, and his classrooms overflowed. Students crowded the aisles, sitting on the floor, hungry for a philosophy that matched the scars of their time. Sartre's voice, gravelly and rapid, filled the room. "You are free," he told them, "and that is terrible news. But it is also the only good news there is." He refused to tell them what to believe. Instead, he made them feel the nausea of choice. "If you seek guidance," he said, "you have already chosen not to think." He wanted them to understand that freedom was not abstract. It was in their everyday lives, in the choice to love honestly, to resist injustice, to speak truth, to take responsibility for even the smallest act. Every cowardice, he warned, creates a world where cowardice is permitted. Beauvoir once told him he demanded too much of people. "Most of us," she said, "are not philosophers. We just want to live." "And living," he answered, is the most difficult philosophy of all. He was not condemning weakness, he was naming it honestly. To be human, for Sartre, was to oscillate between freedom and flight, courage and bad faith. The goal was not perfection, but awareness, to see clearly the moral weight of existence and still move forward. In 1946, he gave a lecture titled Existentialism is a Humanism. The hall was packed beyond capacity. Some expected a defense of despair, others hoped for a new religion. Sartre offered neither. Existentialism, he said, is not pessimism. It does not tell you that man is vile, it tells you that man is responsible. And if he is responsible, there is hope. He explained that since there is no God to decide what is right, the task falls entirely to us. Man, he said, is condemned to invent man. It was both terrifying and redemptive, a sermon without God, faith built on freedom. When he finished, the applause was hesitant, then thunderous. Some wept, others raged, but all felt the same unease, that something had shifted. Philosophy had stepped off the page and into the streets. As fame grew, Sartre began to see the danger of his own influence. His face appeared in newspapers, his words quoted out of context. Some treated existentialism as fashion, black turtlenecks and cigarettes, a posture of despair. It disgusted him. Freedom was not a trend. It was a demand. He withdrew again into writing, turning the gaze inward. In private, he felt the full weight of what he had preached. Freedom, he realized, was not only the right to act, but the duty to respond, even to failure. To blame one's circumstances, one's childhood, one's politics, all were forms of bad faith. He confessed once to Beauvoir, "I am terrified of becoming my own contradiction." She laughed softly. "You already are," she said. "That's how you know you're alive." He smiled at that because she was right. Responsibility was not the end of anxiety, it was its refinement. To live responsibly was to live permanently awake, unable to rest in certainty. Years later, when he reflected on those times, he wrote, "Responsibility is the price of being conscious. It is the tax we pay for the miracle of saying, 'I am.'" That line summarized everything. Existence was not punishment, it was an invitation. The universe may be silent, but that silence gives us the stage. Each of us is playwright, actor, and audience, performing the fragile drama of meaning in real time. He often ended his lectures with a single sentence that left the room quiet. To be free is not to do what you want. It is to want what you do. In that paradox lay his whole philosophy. Freedom without responsibility is chaos. Responsibility without freedom is slavery. Between them lies the narrow, trembling bridge of authentic existence, the bridge he and Beauvoir had spent their lives crossing. On his desk, he kept a small note scribbled during the war. Every action is a stone in the building of the world. He would glance at it before writing, before speaking, before deciding. It was a reminder that nothing is small in a universe where meaning depends on man. One evening, he and Beauvoir watched the sunset from the balcony of their apartment. The city below buzzed with the optimism of recovery, young lovers, jazz music, the pulse of rebirth. Sartre felt the rare calm of acceptance. "Do you think," he asked her, "that we've done enough?" She looked at him, her expression somewhere between affection and irony. "Enough?" she said. "There's no such thing. But we've done something. That's what matters." He nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, something. That's already a beginning." The sky darkened, the lights of Paris flickered to life. He realized that responsibility was not a mountain to climb, but an endless horizon to walk. One choice after another. One truth at a time. There would be no rest, no absolution, no final verdict. And yet, Within that uncertainty, he felt the quiet triumph of existence itself. The philosopher exhaled, watching the smoke drift upward into the blue night. Freedom had given him the burden of responsibility. And responsibility, in turn, had given him the only meaning he could trust, the meaning he created. The 1950s arrived like a tide of reason after the storm. Science was triumphant. The atom had been split, the human genome begun to whisper its code, and psychology promised to map the labyrinth of the mind. Everywhere Sartre looked, people were speaking again of laws of matter, laws of thought, laws of behavior. It seemed as if freedom itself were being rewritten as a mathematical error. He read the headlines with growing unease. Man explained by chemistry, one paper said. The brain is a machine, said another. Behaviorists declared that human action could be predicted like the movement of planets. Marxists insisted that history determined every revolution. Biologists claimed that genes dictated destiny. Even love was being measured in hormones. For Sartre, who had spent his life defending the unpredictability of consciousness, this was a new kind of war, a quiet, intellectual occupation. The enemy was no longer fascism or God, but determinism, the belief that man was a product, not a creator. He sat again in Café de Flore, older now, his hair graying, his fame heavy. The same tables where he had once argued for existentialism were now filled with young students quoting Freud, Skinner, Pavlov, Marx. They spoke of conditioning, of subconscious drives, of historical necessity. They believed the self was an illusion, freedom a dream. Sartre listened patiently, then smiled. Perhaps, he said softly, but even your belief in determinism is a choice. That was the irony he saw everywhere. Even to deny freedom, one must first exercise it. He began to write against this new wave of mechanistic thought. Freedom, he argued, was not an empirical fact to be proven or disproven. It was the structure of human existence itself. To be conscious is to transcend. Consciousness is not a machine reacting to stimuli. It is the awareness of those stimuli and the ability to interpret them differently. A stone falls when thrown. A man, knowing he is thrown, may change the meaning of falling. That difference, invisible to science, was everything. He wrote, "Man is not what happens to him, but what he makes of what happens to him." It became one of his most quoted lines, and, for him, one of the truest. He saw determinism as another form of bad faith, a collective attempt to hide from the terror of freedom behind the comfort of inevitability. To say, "I couldn't help it," was simply the modern version of saying, "God willed it." Both erased responsibility. Both killed authenticity. Still, Sartre respected the thinkers who challenged him. He admired Freud's courage to look into the abyss of the unconscious. He even agreed that the body and society shape the conditions of existence. But he refused to let those conditions become destiny. "We are not free from our circumstances," he said, "but we are free in them." That distinction mattered more than any metaphysical argument. Circumstances are the given, the birthplace, the skin, the poverty, the trauma. But freedom is the act that responds. You cannot choose where you begin, but you can choose what beginning means. He thought often of the men he had known in the camps. Some survived, others did not, yet their physical conditions were nearly identical. What made the difference, he believed, was not biology or chance, but the interior act of meaning. The choice to endure, to help, to believe, or not. He called this the transcendence of the situation. Man, he said, is not merely a being in the world, but a being beyond the world, not outside it, but always exceeding it. Consciousness is a crack in causality, a space where possibility leaks through. One evening, Beauvoir read him a passage from a young psychologist claiming that personality is the sum of conditioning. Sartre chuckled, then said, "If that were true, no one could write a theory that denies it. The fact that he writes proves him wrong." Beauvoir smiled. "You're impossible," she said. He nodded. "Exactly. And that's the point." For Sartre, impossibility was humanity's secret glory. To be human was to resist final explanation, to remain a question even to oneself. In his later lectures, he began comparing human freedom to art. A painter begins with a blank canvas, the paints, the brushes, the laws of color. These are given, determined. But what appears on the canvas is not. The artist's freedom lives in the composition, in the act of transforming the given into something new. So it is with life. You inherit history, body, culture, trauma. But what you make of them, that is art. Freedom is not escaping causality. It is composing meaning within it. He loved that metaphor. It allowed him to see that determinism and freedom were not opposites, but partners in tension. Without the given, freedom would have nothing to shape. Without freedom, the given would never change. Yet this harmony was fragile. The world kept insisting that everything was explainable. Politicians justified oppression as necessary. Scientists justified inequality as natural. Philosophers justified cynicism as realism. And again, Sartre saw the same ancient impulse, the desire to abdicate responsibility under the name of truth. He wrote, "When man explains himself entirely, he disappears." To preserve mystery was not superstition, it was respect for the living. He began to see determinism as the most seductive of illusions, because it made the unbearable weight of freedom feel lighter. If one is just a product of forces, then one can forgive oneself anything. History becomes the culprit, biology the alibi. But Sartre's awakening during the war had burned those alibis away. He could not forget what he had seen in the camps. Men stripped of everything, yet still responsible for the smallest gesture. Freedom, he knew, was inescapable. Even the decision to surrender it was an act of freedom. As he aged, he became gentler about this truth. He no longer mocked those who sought explanations. He pitied them. He saw that determinism was often born of exhaustion, the fatigue of existing in a world that demanded constant choice. Not everyone could live with perpetual awareness. Perhaps they needed their illusions as one needs sleep. He wrote in a notebook, "We cannot be awake all the time, but we must never forget that we are the ones who sleep." Still, he refused to yield the principle. He believed that freedom was not a doctrine to defend, but a responsibility to renew. It was not something one had. It was something one did. Each time we acted consciously, we recreated it. That, he told Beauvoir one night, was why philosophy could never end. "As long as one person chooses," he said, "the world begins again." She smiled, tired but moved. "You still think like a romantic," she said. "Maybe," he replied, "but it's the only romance worth keeping." When he lectured in the later years, his tone was quieter, more reflective. Gone was the polemic fire of his youth. In its place was a weary compassion. "We are shaped," he told his students, "but we are never finished." He wanted them to understand that determinism is a half-truth, that forces act upon us, yes, but we are also the force that acts back. The human being is both wave and swimmer. The current may be strong, but the direction, the meaning, the defiance, those remain ours to choose. Sometimes, when he looked at the younger generation, born after the war, raised in comfort, he worried that freedom had become abstract again, safe, philosophical. He longed for the urgency of those nights when philosophy had been life and death. But he also felt pride. The fact that they could debate was itself proof that freedom endured. In his final writings of that decade, Sartre tried to reconcile the two halves of the question, freedom and determinism, not by solving them, but by placing them in dialogue. He wrote, "We are not gods, but neither are we things. We are the beings who know that we are determined, and that knowledge changes everything. To know one's conditioning is already to transcend it. To recognize one's past is to begin to rewrite it." He ended the essay with a sentence that could have served as the epitaph of his entire philosophy. Freedom is not the opposite of necessity. It is the consciousness of necessity. That night, he and Beauvoir walked home through the drizzle. The city lights blurred on the wet pavement, and he felt the old mix of melancholy and wonder. So much remained uncertain. The future of humanity, of thought, of himself. Yet he took comfort in that uncertainty. If everything were determined, he thought, the world would be unbearable in its perfection. It is precisely because nothing is guaranteed that beauty and morality exist at all. He turned to Beauvoir and said softly, "Perhaps the universe is mechanical, but it needed us to notice." She laughed. "And to protest," she said. "Yes," he answered, "to protest. Endlessly." The philosopher smiled as they continued walking. Two small figures under one umbrella, free in the only way that matters, not from the rain, but within it. By the late 1950s, Jean-Paul Sartre had become more than a writer, more than a thinker. He was an institution, a symbol of restless conscience. The cafés of Saint-Germain whispered his name the way monasteries once murmured the names of saints. Yet Sartre himself was uneasy. Fame was another kind of prison, admiration another gaze to escape. Philosophy, he felt, could not remain behind the desk. Thought must risk itself in the streets. He had spent years insisting that freedom was inseparable from responsibility. Now the question turned practical. Responsibility to whom? To oneself? To truth? To mankind? The world was changing fast. Revolutions in Asia and Africa, student movements in Europe, a Cold War slicing the planet into ideology. The old certainties had returned, this time wearing political uniforms. And Sartre, the champion of freedom, found himself drawn toward the fire. He began to speak of engagement, the duty of the intellectual not merely to interpret the world, but to transform it. A writer, he declared, is responsible for the world he describes. The phrase landed like a thunderclap. No longer could art claim neutrality. Every sentence was a position, every silence a consent. The pen was not a refuge, but a weapon. In Les Temps Modernes, the journal he and Beauvoir edited, he turned philosophy outward, toward injustice, colonialism, racism, war. He attacked complacency wherever he found it, especially among those who believed thought should remain pure. To write without consequences, he said, is to lie. He sided with workers on strike, defended students beaten by police, and condemned the French war in Algeria long before it was fashionable to do so. To many, he was reckless. To others, prophetic. But to Sartre, it was simply logic. If man is responsible for all mankind, then indifference is complicity. In those years, the philosopher became a street activist. He marched beside factory laborers, gave speeches outside universities, handed out leaflets written with the same urgency he once reserved for metaphysics. Philosophy, he told Beauvoir, must get its shoes dirty. The experience changed him. He had once imagined freedom as a solitary project, a man choosing himself against the void. Now, he saw it pulsing through crowds. The chant of 1,000 voices was freedom multiplied, amplified, demanding justice. He realized that personal authenticity without social engagement was another form of bad faith. the comfortable freedom of those protected by privilege. Yet, he never became a simple ideologue. He flirted with Marxism, but refused to surrender his existential core. Marxism, he said, is the unsurpassable horizon of our time. But he added, only if it remembers that man is not a gear in history, but its author. He admired Marx's analysis of oppression, yet despised the determinism that turned people into instruments of inevitability. For him, the revolution must begin not in the factory or the parliament, but in consciousness, in the refusal to let systems think in one's place. The paradox deepened. Sartre, who had spent decades insisting that man is condemned to freedom, now sought solidarity, a collective freedom that did not erase individuality. Could such a thing exist? Could a revolution honor the complexity of the soul? He wrestled with this through his great, unfinished work, Critique of Dialectical Reason. It was his attempt to reconcile existentialism with Marxism, freedom with structure. He spent years on it, filling thousands of pages with dense prose and furious logic. The effort nearly broke him. It is like trying to write fire with ice, he told Beauvoir. Still, he persisted. He described how individual freedom could become collective without dissolving into tyranny. Groups, he said, begin as series, passive crowds, like people waiting for a bus. But when they recognize a shared purpose, they transform into fused groups, free beings acting together toward a common goal. This, for Sartre, was the essence of political awakening, the moment when solitude burns away in the heat of solidarity. He saw it happen during the student uprisings of 1968. The streets of Paris exploded with banners, chants, and barricades. Youths tore down cobblestones to throw at police. Professors argued revolution between clouds of tear gas. Sartre, then in his 60s, wandered through the crowds with notebook in hand, exhilarated. Finally, he said, philosophy is outside again. To the students, he was both hero and comrade. They called him the old lion. He called them the future. When the government banned their newspaper, he sold copies himself at the gates of factories. If they want to arrest me, he said, let them. France would have to call itself a prison. But revolution is rarely as romantic as its slogans. Sartre watched the movement fracture into factions: anarchists, communists, idealists, opportunists. Each claimed to speak for the people. None agreed what freedom meant. He recognized the same danger that haunted every ideology: the temptation to replace thought with obedience. Beauvoir warned him gently, "You're turning freedom into duty again." He smiled. "And you're turning duty into irony." They both laughed, but the tension remained. How to fight for justice without repeating the mistakes of faith? How to believe passionately without becoming blind? Sartre's answer was humility. The revolutionary, he said, must never forget that he, too, can become the oppressor. Freedom has no resting place. It must be renewed in every act, even rebellion. As he aged, his activism deepened into compassion. He defended the oppressed not from abstract theory, but from empathy. He visited prisoners, supported anti-colonial movements in Vietnam and Algeria, condemned torture by his own government. When he met Che Guevara in 1960, he called him the most complete human being of our time. Yet he also warned against turning Guevara into an idol. Revolution, he said, dies the moment it stops doubting itself. He began to see that philosophy's final task was not to explain freedom, but to protect it, from power, from dogma, even from itself. In one lecture, he told his audience, "We must will freedom not only for ourselves, but for everyone, even for those who oppose us. Otherwise, what we build will turn into another prison." By the early 1970s, his health had begun to fail. His eyesight dimmed. He could no longer read without help. But he kept writing, dictating, arguing. The blindness, he joked, was an advantage. Now, I cannot see the faces of my critics. Yet in private, he admitted to Beauvoir that losing his sight felt like losing the world. Perhaps, she told him, it's time to see differently. And so he did. He began speaking less of systems and more of compassion. Freedom, he said, was not only a metaphysical burden or a political right, it was an act of care. To will another's freedom was to recognize their humanity. The revolutionary, stripped of anger, becomes a guardian. In his last interviews, he softened. I no longer believe in total systems, he confessed, only in particular lives, particular choices. He had walked the long arc from abstraction to intimacy, from the philosopher of the void to the defender of the person. When asked what he had learned after decades of struggle, Sartre answered quietly that freedom without love becomes cruelty, and love without freedom becomes possession. He had spent his life trying to keep the two together, thought and action, solitude and solidarity, Beauvoir and himself, freedom and responsibility. He never reconciled them perfectly, but perhaps that was the point. Philosophy, like revolution, is a work in progress. In his last public speech, his voice trembling but clear, he said, "We must act as if we are free, not because it is easy, but because it is true." The audience stood in silence. They understood that the old lion was speaking not as an icon, but as a man who had lived his ideas, imperfectly, relentlessly, honestly. When he left the stage, he turned to Beauvoir and whispered, "It was always about them, wasn't it? The others." She nodded. "Yes, and about us." They walked out into the Paris night, the same streets where everything had begun. Around them, the city hummed with life, indifferent yet alive, full of unfinished revolutions. Sartre smiled faintly. "Freedom," he said, "was never the end. It was the beginning." And with that, the revolutionary philosopher disappeared into the crowd he had spent his life trying to awaken. Not above it, but within it, one free being among others. The years after the revolution were quieter, at least on the surface. Sartre was now an old man, his once fierce eyes clouded by blindness, his hands trembling when he reached for a cup. The cafés still whispered his name, but the world around him had moved on. Existentialism had become syllabus material. The slogans that once set the streets on fire now decorated student notebooks. He had become, he feared, what he never wanted to be, a monument. The irony did not escape him. He had spent his life dismantling illusions, only to become one himself. The philosopher who taught that man is condemned to freedom was now condemned to fame. Frozen into an image, quoted more than read, revered more than understood. Simone de Beauvoir remained by his side, steady and luminous as ever, though time had carved gentleness into her sharpness. They still met daily, talked, laughed, argued. But even in her presence, he began to feel the quiet gravity of solitude pressing harder each day. Freedom, he once said, was the space between two consciousnesses that recognize each other as free. But what happens when one of those consciousnesses begins to fade? When the world around you turns to shadows and voices, and the only freedom left is the one inside your mind. He spent long afternoons in his apartment on Rue Bonaparte, sitting by the window, unable to see the city he had once described with such precision. The sounds of Paris came to him like memories. The hum of cars, the distant chatter, the sudden cry of a street vendor. Each sound was a ghost of a world he could no longer fully touch. Beauvoir would read to him, newspapers, letters, manuscripts. Sometimes he would interrupt. "No, not that. Tell me about the light. How does it fall today?" She would describe the color of the sky, the movement of the leaves, the way the sun shimmered like mercury. He would smile faintly and say, "Good, that's enough. I can see it now." But he could not see himself. And that was the loneliness that cut deepest. Not the absence of others, but the growing distance between the thinker and his own reflection. For decades, he had built his philosophy on self-awareness, on the idea that to exist is to define oneself through choice. But what happens when the self grows dim, when will and body begin to drift apart? He had always feared becoming an object, a thing in the world, rather than a consciousness shaping it. Now, as illness crept closer, he could feel that transformation beginning. The philosopher who had once written that to be looked at is to be imprisoned now lived under constant care. Doctors, nurses, students, admirers. Their kindness was sincere, but it pressed on him like the gaze he had described decades ago. He would whisper to Beauvoir, "They treat me as if I've already stopped existing." She would take his hand and say, "Then keep speaking, keep being." And he tried. He dictated interviews, reflections, fragments of unfinished works. The sentences came slower, the thoughts heavier, but the will remained, the stubborn refusal to be finished. In those twilight years, Sartre began to revisit the paradox at the heart of his life. That absolute freedom, carried to its end, leads to absolute loneliness. For freedom means no guarantees, no external meaning, no higher order to console you. To live completely free is to live without shelter, even from yourself. He remembered the nights in his youth when he had celebrated this condition, when the idea of self-creation had thrilled him. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. It had sounded like liberation then. Now it felt like exile. He realized that freedom had always been double-edged. It gave him dignity, but it also took away belonging. It allowed him to reject false gods, but it left him with the silence that followed. The universe, he thought, is perfectly democratic. It gives us freedom and indifference in equal measure. There were moments when that indifference felt unbearable. He would wake in the middle of the night, groping for the edge of the table, the sound of his own breathing amplified in the dark. The mind that had once held entire philosophies now wrestled with the simplest question. Am I still myself? Freedom, he realized, was not something one owned forever. It had to be renewed, even in weakness. Every morning he forced himself to rise, to listen, to speak, to choose, however small the choice. Even blindness, he told a visitor once, is something one must choose how to bear. Beauvoir became his lifeline. She too was aging, her body betraying her in its own quiet ways, but she refused to let him vanish into abstraction. "You taught us to exist," she would tell him, "so don't stop now." He loved her more fiercely in those years than he ever had in youth, not romantically, but existentially. Their bond was proof that freedom need not end in isolation. It could survive in companionship, in dialogue, in mutual recognition. But even she could not bridge the entire distance. There are parts of dying that no one can share. One evening, she found him dozing in his chair, his face turned toward the open window. The sunset painted the room in gold, but his eyes were closed. "You look peaceful," she said softly. He smiled without opening his eyes. "Peace is just another word for surrender," he said. "And I haven't surrendered yet." He thought often of his past, the war, the lectures, the protests, the crowds. Sometimes he wondered if all that noise had been an elaborate attempt to silence a deeper solitude. The philosopher surrounded by people, always talking about we, but forever alone in the act of thought. Freedom, after all, had always been a solitary experience. No one could choose for you. No one could carry your responsibility. Even love, as he and Beauvoir had lived it, had been a delicate negotiation between two solitudes, They had proven that freedom could be shared, but only by two beings who accepted that it never fully merged. He wrote one last note on this paradox. We are together only in our separateness. The bridge between us is the distance itself. It was perhaps the saddest and most beautiful line he ever wrote. As the 1970s faded into the 1980s, Sartre's health declined rapidly. His world shrank to a few rooms, a few visitors, the steady voice of Beauvoir, reading aloud, yet even in decline, he remained defiant. When asked by a journalist if he feared death, he answered, "No, I only fear ceasing to question." That was his last act of faith, not in God, but in the unending motion of thought. For even as his body betrayed him, his mind still searched for meaning, still refused finality. Sometimes he would speak as if to himself. Perhaps freedom never belonged to us at all. Perhaps it is the movement of life itself, passing through us, using us, leaving us. Beauvoir would squeeze his hand. "Then you have served it well," she'd say. He smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I only chased it." In the spring of 1980, Sartre's body finally yielded. He died quietly, without ceremony, at the age of 74. But the city did not stay quiet. When the news spread, more than 50,000 people filled the streets of Paris to follow his coffin. Workers, students, lovers, skeptics. Generations who had once argued, raged, and dreamed under his words. Beauvoir walked behind the hearse, her face calm but pale. Later she would write, "His death separated us. My death will reunite us." But in truth, Sartre had never belonged to anyone, not even to her. He belonged to the restless freedom he had spent his life describing. In his final notebook, found after his death, there was a line written in shaky handwriting. "To be free is to be alone, and to bear it without despair." That was the culmination of his philosophy. The acceptance that loneliness was not the failure of freedom, but its final form. When no God remains, when no system explains, when even love cannot save you from yourself, what is left is the quiet dignity of consciousness, aware of its limits, yet still choosing. That is what Sartre had sought all along. Not happiness, not peace, but lucidity. The courage to stand alone in the face of existence and still say yes. And perhaps, somewhere beyond thought, that was enough. It was winter, 1980. The Paris air was cold and thin, filled with the slow rhythm of a city that had already mourned him once in anticipation. Sartre sat in a narrow apartment filled with books he could no longer see. Their spines were only textures beneath his fingertips now, familiar like the faces of old friends. The light filtered weakly through the curtains. Simone de Beauvoir sat across from him, silent, watching. That afternoon, a young journalist had come for what would become his last interview. She was nervous. Barely 30, clutching a small tape recorder like a weapon against history. To her, Sartre was not just a philosopher, but a legend who had already crossed into myth. But when she saw him, blind, fragile, his voice still deliberate, she understood that what she was about to record was not the end of a story, but its quiet closing gesture. She asked softly, "Monsieur Sartre, do you still believe in freedom?" He smiled, that half smile that always carried fatigue and irony. "I have no reason to stop believing," he said. "But perhaps now I understand it differently. Freedom is not a gift, it's a weight. The young want wings. The old learn the gravity that holds them." The interview moved slowly. His answers came with long pauses, as if he were listening for the words before speaking them. The journalist noticed how he often said "we" instead of "I." When she asked about it, he replied, "I have spoken for myself all my life. Now I prefer to speak for us, for the species condemned to consciousness." He touched the table lightly, tracing the grain of the wood. Freedom, he said again, was once my battle cry. I used to think it was the source of all meaning. Now I see it is also the source of all suffering. To be free is to be unable to escape oneself. The tape recorder whirred. The young woman hesitated. And yet, she said, you've inspired generations to embrace freedom as hope. He nodded slowly. Yes, because hope is also an act. Even despair can be active. What matters is not whether the universe has meaning, but that we refuse to live as if it does not. At one point, Beauvoir brought tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup beside him. Sartre reached out, found her wrist, and smiled. See? I am still capable of grasping what I cannot see. The journalist smiled politely, unsure whether it was a joke or a metaphor. It was both. When she asked if he feared death, he laughed, a short hoarse sound that turned into coughing. Fear? No. Boredom, perhaps. I've already rehearsed it many times, every night when I stop thinking. Death is only the last time one forgets to begin again. She asked, do you believe anything waits beyond it? He shook his head. No, but I like to imagine that nothingness is gentle. After all, I have lived beside it long enough. Then, quieter. If there were something beyond, I would want it to be the chance to choose once more. The questions became more personal. She asked if he was proud of his life. He frowned slightly, as if pride were a language he had forgotten. I don't know what pride means, he said. I made mistakes, many. I spoke when I should have been silent, and I was silent when I should have shouted. But at least I never pretended that the world owed me an answer. I faced it standing. He added after a pause, that's all philosophy ever was. The art of standing. Beauvoir looked up at him then, her eyes glistening. He reached for her hand. And she, he said softly, taught me how to stand beside someone. The journalist felt an ache rise in her throat. It was not pity. It was the sudden realization that even the greatest minds end not with conclusions, but with tenderness. They spoke of the new world, computers, rockets, genetic codes. Do you think, she asked, that technology will finally explain man? Sartre smiled faintly. Perhaps. But it will never explain why he wants to be more than he is. The machine can describe thought, but it cannot describe yearning. He leaned back in his chair. The day man stops yearning, philosophy will be finished. And perhaps that will be peace. But it will also be death. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, tell them not to stop questioning, even when it hurts. The journalist scribbled it down word for word. As the interview drew to a close, she asked him one final question. If you could speak to your younger self, the man of being and nothingness, the revolutionary of le temps moderne, what would you tell him? Sartre thought for a long time. The clock ticked. Beauvoir watched him carefully, as if guarding his silence. Finally, he said, I would tell him that freedom is not something to win. It is something to outlive. He paused again, then added quietly, and that love is the only rebellion that lasts. The journalist sat motionless. On the tape, his voice trembled, not from weakness, but from clarity. It was the sound of a man speaking from the far edge of his own philosophy. When she turned off the recorder, there was a long silence. The afternoon light had dimmed. Beauvoir stood, adjusting his scarf around his shoulders. You've tired him enough, she said gently. The journalist apologized, but Sartre shook his head. No, it's good. One must keep explaining, even at the end. Perhaps that's what eternity is, the conversation that never concludes. He smiled again. And tell them I have not changed my mind. Man is still free, even here, even blind, even dying. Especially then. A few weeks later, when the interview was published, the title read, Jean-Paul Sartre, the man who refused to end. It was fitting, because Sartre's last words to the journalist were not an ending, but an instruction, a final act of rebellion against silence. Existence continues. Make something of it. The day after his death, Paris was gray. The rain fell softly, almost respectfully, as if the sky itself understood that silence had to change its texture. Thousands walked the streets behind his coffin, holding umbrellas like dark petals. There was no music, no slogans, no manifestos, only the quiet murmur of footsteps, the collective breathing of a city saying goodbye to the man who had taught it to breathe on its own. Simone de Beauvoir walked alone at the front. She did not weep. Her face, calm and austere, carried the weight of two lives, hers and his. The crowd saw her as a monument too, but she was only a woman walking beside an absence. Later she would write, "His death separated us. My death will reunite us." But even that was only half true. What Sartre left behind was not a ghost to reunite with. It was an idea that refused to rest. In the weeks that followed, students and journalists filled the cafés again, arguing over his legacy. Some said he had changed philosophy forever. Others said he had been wrong from the beginning. But what none of them could deny was that his absence felt oddly alive. It was as if the void he had spoken of for decades had finally entered the room. Invisible, undeniable, waiting. That void was his final subject. Nothingness. For Sartre, nothingness was never mere emptiness. It was not the dark hole where meaning goes to die. It was the open space where meaning begins. Nothingness, he had written, lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm in an apple. It sounded grotesque, but he meant it as liberation. Because without the crack of nothingness, being would be solid, inert, eternal, a stone. It is nothingness, he said, that allows us to question, to imagine, to change. The ability to say no, to reject what is, to dream of what could be, that is the signature of consciousness. A table exists, but it does not know it exists. A man exists and knows he exists, and that thin awareness creates the gap between him and the world. That gap is freedom. That gap is anguish. That gap is life. In the final months before his death, Sartre had returned again and again to that gap. He spoke of it as if it were a friend he had always misunderstood. Nothingness, he told one visitor, is not what remains when life ends. It is what allows life to begin again every second. To exist is to fall into that gap. To live knowing that no meaning is given, and yet to go on creating meaning anyway. That act, repeated endlessly, is the defiance that keeps the human spirit alive. He used to call it nihilism overcome, not denial of the void, but a dance with it. The atheist's version of faith, to live fully, knowing the abyss never closes. Beauvoir understood this better than anyone. In the months after his death, she continued their routine as if he were still there. Morning tea, a quiet hour of reading, long walks by the Seine. She said she could still hear his voice in the cadence of her thoughts. She kept writing, but her prose grew gentler, less combative. She no longer needed to prove meaning. She simply inhabited it. One evening, a student asked her, "Madame, do you believe Sartre is gone?" She thought for a long time before answering. "Gone," she said softly. "No." Jean-Paul believed that to exist was to make meaning from nothing. And meaning doesn't die. It only changes form. That was the secret he had never confessed directly. That nothingness, far from erasing us, connects us. Because every choice, every act of creation, leaves a trace. Even when the body disappears, the choices remain, echoing through others, shaping the world invisibly. Sartre had no heaven to believe in, but he left behind a more fragile eternity. The continuity of influence, the persistence of thought. And so the cafés filled again with young people asking the same questions he had once asked. What does it mean to be free? How do we live without God? Why must we act if nothing lasts? They asked. And in asking, they kept him alive. For Sartre, the act of questioning was the pulse of existence itself. The meaning of nothingness, then, was not despair, but invitation. It was the open door at the center of reality, terrifying, yes, but also generous. The universe offers us no script, no final act, no applause. It hands us a blank page. And what we write there, trembling and uncertain, becomes our only testament. Sartre had once said, "Man is a useless passion." He meant it not as insult, but as celebration. To be useless in a purposeless universe is to be free of function, to create value purely for its own sake. Like art, like love, like laughter in the dark. That, perhaps, was why people still mourned him. He had given them permission to be unfinished, to be uncertain, to be human without excuse. Years later, Beauvoir would be buried beside him in Montparnasse Cemetery. On their shared gravestone, tourists often leave pens, cigarettes, scraps of paper, offerings to the gods of thought who denied gods altogether. The rain washes them away, but new ones always appear. It is a small ritual of persistence, a proof that even nothingness needs witnesses. Standing there, one can almost feel what Sartre meant when he said, "To die is to become what one was." The nothingness that follows life does not erase it. It completes the sentence. In the end, the meaning of nothingness is the meaning of freedom itself. Both are absences that make creation possible. Both demand courage. Both remind us that existence is fragile. But in that fragility lies the only kind of immortality that matters. We live, we choose, we fail, we begin again. We write on the blank page of the void, and in doing so, the void becomes story. Sartre would have smiled at that thought. He might have said, "The universe does not care, and that is its greatest gift, because care is our invention. And if nothingness is what awaits us, then we can still choose to meet it standing, aware, defiant, alive to the last moment, whispering as Sartre did through every word of his life. Existence precedes essence. The rest is up to us."